joining us today. You have been a staunch women's rights activist since beginning your political career in 2001. Your activism has taken on a level of urgency in recent years. Since coming to power in 2021, the Taliban have effectively banned women in Afghanistan from public life. Girls cannot pursue an education beyond the 6th grade. Women cannot travel without a male chaperone. In other words, the situation is dire. You have coined this reality a gender apartheid. My first question to you is whether the international community is responding to this designation and why there has been a lack of substantive action from parties, including the West and the United Nations.
Thank you so much, Farishta John. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here in one of the prestigious and beautiful universities in a sunny day. I was here before twice already, but it was not as sunny as it is today, not very common to the UK. Well, you have said, Farishta John, that I have been a women's rights activist since 2001. I must say that I have been a women's rights activist since I was born. The reason is because the life I have experienced, or my first welcome in this world was in a way that automatically injected this sense of activism. I was not a favored daughter in my family when I was born, so that gave me always this sense of trying to change and become a favored one. From being invisible to making myself visible is a constant struggle I have had. But not only for myself, I realized that this is the life of most women born in our parts of the world, especially in Afghanistan. On your question about the international community in Afghanistan, I think what happened in Afghanistan in terms of the withdrawal of, especially the withdrawal of the American and international troops is has undermined the United States world leadership. I personally think if the way they withdraw from Afghanistan, which led to a collapse and re-emerge of Taliban, or taking over Kabul by Taliban, it would have not been, the war in Ukraine would have not been possible if the withdrawal in Afghanistan was not the same way as it is now. So I think it actually, in a way, changed the world order. And in Afghanistan, many people tell me that, why the army of 150,000 army, more than 120,000 police, same intelligence forces, why all of them collapsed in a matter of like few hours? Living in Afghanistan and being engaged in the negotiation with Taliban, I don't think actually the collapse happened over time. I think it happened from the time that the negotiations started with the Taliban, between the United States and the Taliban, because obviously the United States and the Afghan government were partners, right? When the US went to Afghanistan on October 2001, if you listen to President George W. Bush's statement, he says, we are going to Afghanistan to support women of Afghanistan, to help people of Afghanistan exercise democracy, to dismantle Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So they regarded people of Afghanistan as their partner, but all of a sudden they left their partner and then they withdraw. So the withdrawal happened, the collapse happened when they started talking about withdrawal, because it affected the morale of our forces, and their partner, which was the government of Afghanistan, was excluded from all of this.
Thank you for the response. So moving on to the Taliban lays claim to their so-called legitimacy through drawing upon cultural conservatism and Pashtun nationalism. Yet they also thrive largely through positioning themselves as the antidote to Western interventionism. How have you tried to take on these underlying structural causes for their popularity?
So the Taliban, initially, they claimed that two narratives. The first narrative was that they said that they have changed, that there is, and also this narrative was also echoed by international community as well. Many diplomats who traveled to Afghanistan during negotiation, after negotiation, they were all telling us, well, the Taliban have changed, there is 2.0 Taliban. That was the narrative promoted by the world, on the basis of which we actually negotiated with Taliban, with the hope that they have changed, let's talk to them, maybe we will bring a political settlement that will be acceptable by all sides, if not favored, at least acceptable by all sides. The second narrative they were promoting was that they are the only group who will fight other military extremist groups, including Daesh. There are now 25 military extremist groups in Afghanistan, operate between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia, including Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, including East Turkestan Islamic Movement, TTP, which is Tariq Taliban Pakistan, TTT, which is Tariq Taliban Tajikistan, Al-Qaeda in subcontinent of India, Al-Qaeda itself. All of these groups now operate between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Obviously, they're inspired by Taliban's victory, the way the Taliban took over. Many of these groups believe that persistency, continued stand against the West, fight, use of violence, suicide bombing, any kind of violence will get them to where they want. So they are inspired. And Taliban use these narratives that they will fight these groups. But in reality, after Taliban take over, there is no Taliban 2.0, at least in the public sphere. They haven't, they have become very repressive on women's rights, and their presence have inspired other groups. So the two narratives that they have created are proven to be false. And when it comes to public support, I think there is no survey or research indicating how much popularity the Taliban have. But obviously, as a student of political science, I can say that 10 to 15% of the population probably initially when the Taliban took over support them. Now their repressive measures plus the poverty and lack of any kind of governance even further reduce their popularity. The problem is that there is no alternative. I don't think that the world does not allow alternative. I don't think Taliban will be able to sustain power. I think it's from our part, it's the world, the international community, the political community that is not being able to create an alternative.
You just mentioned all the weaknesses in governance of the Taliban regime. And so I want to focus on that a little bit. You're famous for negotiating with the Taliban in Doha.
Right.
Before all this happened in 2021. What were, according to you, the fundamental weaknesses in the Taliban's bargaining strategy? And did you actually ever seek to kind of exploit those shortcomings to make some significant headways during the negotiation or even after that?
So the Taliban major weakness is that they are so outdated, that they don't know the skills and the knowledge of the new government or the new governors. When I first talked to the Taliban, it was in February 2019, and it was in Moscow, in the President Hotel. The President Hotel in Moscow is like a government hotel or government shared hotel. It's very historic, and I met them for the first time there. We were a delegation of 60 people, only 2 women. And obviously, being kind of vocal on women's rights, all the burden was on my shoulder in terms of representing women voices. Each Taliban delegation was assigned to talk about the subject. So one of the Taliban leaders, who is now the Minister of Mine and Industry, he talked about the Taliban perspective on women's rights. And one of the Taliban leaders, who I think does not have a job because he's very senior, he's getting old, he talked about the Taliban perspective on army and police. As I was listening to this gentleman who was talking about what what the role of an Islamic army is, I was listening to him, and meanwhile I was like checking my Twitter. The flow of information, how much updated the world is, and listening to him, how old-dated and outdated the piece of information that he is like referring to in terms of what the army and Islamic army responsibility is, etc., etc. You think that he is like one of those not religious clerk, but imams.
Yeah.
The imams who are usually in charge of like the priest, in charge of the mosque and prayers in the mosque. They don't have a lot of information and knowledge on Islam, so they're not scholars of Islam, but they have basics. And most of the Friday prayers, they pick up a subject to talk about, which is not actually based on the principles of Islam. Sometimes they mix also tradition. So I was listening that I'm listening to an imam and they don't know anything about the government or the government. The second thing that I think, which was something we were leveraging or exploiting, as you said, during the negotiation, initially they thought as women that we are there just for the decoration. We are puppet of the US government. We're there to design and make the negotiation look good as women, but we do not add anything. We do not have knowledge. We do not have information about the governance, etc. But when the negotiations started, I could see the difference between our delegation, which was representing the Republic, and the Taliban, in terms of the in-depth knowledge we have, the diversity of views we have, referring to figures, to facts, to the laws, to the constitution, to the international treaties, to the practices around the world. I could see how different our views are. The only weapon they use always is referring to Islam.
Okay.
So even when they refer to Islam and you ask them, what does it mean if they could elaborate? They cannot elaborate. One of the issues that, last year around this time, not last year, 2 years ago, around this time we were having some serious discussion with the Taliban. Sometimes when I remember those days and how passionate, your phone brings the photos, reminds you of those days, right? So it was reminding me of one of the days today with a photo. And I was looking at it and looking at the discussion, how serious the discussions were last year around this time. We were discussing about what would a government look like after the peace talk, after the political settlement. The Taliban were only referring to an Islamic government. And we were like, okay, an Islamic government cannot be a form of government. Islam could be a process on the basis of which a government will function, like constitution, etc., and religion. But not there cannot be a government which will only purely run based on Islamic principles, because any government would have to have laws, constitution, procedures anywhere in the world. And they were only saying Islamic government. And our question was like, what do you mean when you say Islamic government? Is that like Islamic government of Emirate or Republic, or what is the form you want? They had no knowledge. They were like, when we come to that point, we will bring experts to talk to you. Yeah, so this was, they were outdated, and they were weaponizing and instrumentalizing religion, which most of them didn't actually have actual Islam knowledge. Studying in the university, in Kabul University, because I graduated from Kabul University, Law and Political Science Faculty, we have one course which is the principles of Islam. And I think my knowledge of the principles of Islam was in many occasions higher than them. Obviously, we had other religious scholars in our group which had more information.
I just kind of want to follow up on that. So you said that there was a disconnect between what you represent and what they saw you as representing. And they saw you, and I think this is a very interesting point, you said they saw you as representing or being a puppet of the US government. Now, so my question really is, just kind of going on top of that point, do you think the Trump administration or the US administration should bear the responsibility for the collapse of the negotiation, or for whatever that kind of ensued after that?
Absolutely. Afghanistan is, I think, the major US foreign policy failure of both presidents, not only President Trump, but former President Trump, but also President Biden. The United States wanted to get out of Afghanistan because this issue of Afghanistan and the war was one of the domestic issues for them. So they wanted to get out of Afghanistan. They wanted to negotiate and find a way with the Taliban to get out of Afghanistan. The major fact contribute to the collapse was that they negotiated with the Taliban without including the Afghan Republic, or one of their main partner, which was the Republic. Now, I'm not talking about president or individuals in the government. I'm talking about the major society in Afghanistan, the political community, the civil society, the women groups. They were excluded. Obviously, in any peace process, politics of exclusion is not going to make the peace process sustainable, right? So this they negotiated their own issues. Basically, the United States negotiated their own issues. When we talked to them and we asked them why you have not included the Afghan government from the beginning, like they started the Qatar office for Taliban in Doha in 2011. Since 2011, there was like behind the curtain negotiation going on. They started the actual negotiation in 2018. They were only briefing the government of Afghanistan from time to time. The American diplomats would come to Kabul and brief the Afghan government and the leadership on the progress that they have. They wouldn't share any in-depth papers, any details about their negotiation, etc. So when we were like challenging some of the American diplomats and the US Embassy would host events and meetings, we would challenge some of the American diplomats, especially the guy who was in charge of this negotiation, who is with an Afghan background, born in Afghanistan, with the US citizenship. His name is Zalmay Khalilzad. When now obviously he resigned from the job. When we asked him and challenged him about exclusion of the whole political society that was regarded as their partner, he was like, we are discussing our own issues. When you go to negotiation, like the intra-Afghan negotiation, the so-called intra-Afghan negotiations start, like between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban, then you start your own issues. So, and when we were asking them, what is your issue that you are talking to Taliban? They basically negotiated 4 issues, which is also mentioned in the Doha agreement signed between the United States and the Taliban on the 29th of February 2020. In that agreement, you have seen probably most of you that big photo of the Taliban and Zalmay Khalilzad shaking hand, and the Taliban cheering and celebrating with Allahu Akbar as their victory. We were waiting to start the negotiation. So they negotiated 4 things. First, the Taliban will be basically in charge of Afghanistan security, and they will fight other military extremist groups. As I said before, the narrative they created was that they are the ones fighting other military extremist groups. While the reason that Americans invaded Afghanistan or came to Afghanistan was primarily the reason was that that their own territory was attacked from Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda in Taliban's presence. So how do you expect a group that hosted Al-Qaeda to fight other military extremist groups? The second issue was that Americans would withdraw by April 2021, by May 2021, but the withdrawal was conditions based. It's clear in the Doha agreement that the withdrawal will happen only when there is a political settlement, and the political settlement will result to political participation and power sharing. And the third one was the release of the prisoners, the 5,000 prisoners by Taliban. So the withdrawal was the last. In fact, it means there was a famous quote, obviously they used it in the negotiations, that nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon in the peace process. This was something Khalilzad was using always in his interventions on media, that nothing is agreed upon until we agree on everything, and we implement everything as a package. So everything means the Taliban must commit to a political dialogue for a political settlement, which after signing the Doha deal, they never actually were serious. And then release of prisoners. The Afghan government released 5,000 prisoners, most of them very, very high criminals, including people who were involved in smuggling and drug and crimes, not only ideology or being a Taliban, but crimes. They released 5,000 with a good fate, or rather in a political game, I would say, which I will explain in the next question. And the third one was the withdrawal of international forces, which the withdrawal happened first before other conditions were met. So I think this was a major failure, and the United States don't want to, or it's like we made a mistake, we don't want to hear about it. Now I see in the US Congress, the Republicans, for instance, question the Democrats. So it becomes a matter of political party, bi-party or political party discussion rather than what happened to Afghanistan and why it happened. It's not about the people of Afghanistan, it's not about the foreign policy of the US. I was speaking at the Security Council in September, and after my speech there was a debate between the Russian ambassador and then the American permanent representative in UN. and the whole discussion was about Afghanistan, but they took it to Ukraine. And then about Afghanistan was like, whose withdrawal was better? It was Russian withdrawal better or the US withdrawal? I actually note down, because I was briefing the Security Council, the rule is that they don't give you a second chance to speak, but my intervention would have been that probably the Russians' intervention was worse, but the American withdrawal was worse than that. The way it happened, you know? Because at least the Russians, they said goodbye, and there was like tanks, and if you look at the history, the videos, they were like in a proper way, you know? They went, and 3 years later, the government collapsed. But in this case, the last American soldier, if you look at the plane, the last American soldiers left on the 31st of August 2021, and after that, Taliban were already in Kabul, in power, and they started shooting. I was also in Kabul. They started shooting. You know, the sky was full of fire in celebration of their victory. So the difference was that Americans left when Taliban were in Kabul, and the Russians left when jihadi groups that were, you know, fighting were in the mountains.
No, I think it's a very visceral image that we all remember back in 2021, where the planes from Kabul airport was leaving, the US plane, and people were running after the plane. Frishta, I think you have a question about Western intervention and the dynamics behind that.
Yeah, so just talking more about Kabul's handover. You have spoken up openly about the inadequacy and failings of Ashraf Ghani's government. Upon Kabul's handover, innocent Afghans were left in the dark while senior officials fled. I understand they were in a difficult position, but do you think they could have done a better job in protecting the rights and interests of ordinary citizens?
The politicians?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I believe if Ashraf Ghani, which is the former president, if he didn't flee the way he fled, and if he managed things the way, in a better way, we would have not been we will have not been where we are now in terms of the collapse. I think he contributed to the collapse. Yes, the collapse happened. There was a demoralization of the forces after the Doha deal was signed with the Taliban, but him fleeing paved the way for Taliban return. Obviously, people had no options.
Yeah.
Now, some people say, why the people of Kabul didn't fight? Why everybody didn't pick up a gun to fight? People were panicking. I was in Kabul when I could see people everybody was getting out of their homes. They didn't know where to go, what to do. So Kabul was full of cars. People wanted to just escape where they are. They wanted to escape the current moment, the present moment. They didn't know what they want to do, where they want to go. At 1 o'clock or 1:30, we heard that the president fled Afghanistan. It was a huge disappointment on everybody, and then followed by the rest of the politicians and the kind of the cream of society. I always think that, and I say it on public as well, that this evacuation was a mistake, as the withdrawal was a mistake. Because if there was no evacuation, now evacuation evacuated a lot of people of influence, political figures, civil society figures, activists, media, journalists. Some of them, most of them, their lives were at risk. But freedom comes with a cost. If, for instance, like 3 million people were, after that 6 to 7 million people left Afghanistan. Mostly from educated society, civil society, political community. If they were in Afghanistan, and if they could change mobilize the people to become a force against Taliban, do you think the Taliban would have been able to imprison 6 to 7 million people, kill 6, 7 million people? No. Obviously, it was a mistake after the mistake. Yes, Americans wanted to leave and they left, but there was no that leadership, because in politics, having rules, being connected to the people, having people support is very, very important. President Ashraf Ghani, and you know that, President Ashraf Ghani was a professor at one of the American universities. He did not have a route, and people of Afghanistan are very emotional. No matter how you do good for them, but if you don't behave good, they will not. I think Asian generally, right? you need to behave good, you need to respect them, you need to be respectful. No matter how, like as a member of parliament, I have that experience. People were coming to meet me, you know, even if I wouldn't do anything for them, but I would just go and say hi to them and like respect and shake hand and say, I'll try to respect you or do what you want to. They would have been very happy. As comparing to the fact that I would finish their application, do the projects for them, but don't meet them, don't respect them. So Ashraf Ghani was a kind of a elite, disconnect from the realities. But while a country that was really, you know, suffering from 4 decades of war, there was a huge distrust among the people. We needed somebody to unite the people, to bring unity, to become a unifying figure. That was somebody we needed, but instead, he left the country.
So more on this topic of inclusion. Most criticisms of the Taliban are rightly centered on their oppression and exclusion of women. Yet some also suggest that the same problems existed over 2 decades of Western-backed intervention. There are arguments that both Afghan men and women were excluded from decision-making processes. Is there not a fear that in aligning with the West, once again, we end up forgetting about the country, ordinary Afghan citizens?
I must say, first, Shajan, the people of Afghanistan or the ordinary citizens in Afghanistan, they have done their job. Some people now argue that, well, we have internationals, because I do travel a lot and I talk with a lot of people, and a lot of people ask me, what should we do? Because we have done what we were supposed to do in the last 20 years. We were militarily present, we supported financially, what should we do? Which is a very candid question, like Ashraf Ghani sometimes says, it's $1 million question. It's a very candid question, but the point is that that the international community were in Afghanistan, but people's leadership was not there. You know, people were not meaningfully listened to and included to. And I will give you an example. In 2014, and I'm putting all of these information actually in my second book, which will come hopefully by end of this year. In 2014, we had presidential election. There were 2 front-running candidates. Dr. Abdullah, who then became the CEU and he was foreign minister, he is now in Kabul. And Ashraf Ghani, who was heading the transition committee. Transition means international community withdrawing from Afghanistan, and he was basically heading that committee. He was the head of that committee. People voted 52% for Abdullah. Ashraf Ghani got 30-something%. The international community had huge influence over our election commission and election complaint commission. There were 2 entities, election commission and election complaint commission. So what they did was they invalidated a lot of votes for both candidates, for Abdullah and for Ghani, so that Abdullah's vote became less than 50%, and as a result, he was not announced as a winner. Invalidation of the votes would not impact Ashraf Ghani so much because he already had 30-something%. So even if they invalidate 20% of his vote, he would not be the winner anyways. But it impacted the front-runner candidate. I was supporting Abdullah then. And I remember till late in the evening, sometimes till 2 o'clock in the morning, we were discussing with UNAMA, which is the UN Assistance Mission for Afghanistan, the US delegations, several US delegations, the European delegations, about the fraud and about why this is happening in the election. Probably you have been following the news, most others were following the news. People participated in the election despite enormous security challenge. In fact, from one of the districts in Herat province, Herat is bordered with Iran. It's one of the historic places, very beautiful, full of culture and tradition, and it's UNESCO cultural heritage. The Herat minarets are a UNESCO cultural heritage recorded. So it's a beautiful province. From there, 2 people had to travel all the way to the polling station, which was not under Taliban control, but their houses were under Taliban control. So they traveled all the way and they cast their vote. And in the election, because the vote was manual, so they would ink the fingers so that one person could only use vote once. When they came back to their village, the Taliban saw the ink, and they cut the fingers of these people, because why did you participate in the election? They were against the election. That is the price people paid for democracy. But their sacrifice was never counted. Instead, everybody in the international community wanted Ashraf Ghani to win. So they invalidated Abdullah's vote, and the election went to runoff, like the Turkey's election. Obviously, Turkey is a different situation. So the election went to the second round, and in the second round, before the election results were announced, the U.S. State Secretary John Kerry came to Afghanistan, and he negotiated the national unity government. So the election results were not announced, and the national unity government was formed. I was part of the negotiation for national unity government, and I felt bad because I was supporting a candidate that he got 52%. But now I knew that Americans wanted a second candidate to be the president. So when they asked me, what should we do? Yes, you have invested blood and treasure. You have sent your troops, your money to Afghanistan. But I think it's always important that we give leadership to the people. People's leadership must be respected, and the aim must be, as President Bush said, we are there to empower people of Afghanistan, exercise their democracy. We need to empower people, not decide on their behalf.
Okay, thank you for that. So, talking about Afghanistan beyond the Taliban, you have spoken extensively about the existence of multiple realities and interest groups within the country, where the Taliban is just one of them. In recent years, the National Resistance Front has posed themselves as a political and military opposition. How do you perceive their stance on women's rights and their role in shaping Afghanistan's future?
Well, their stance on women's rights is very clear because they are supporting. In fact, no other group in Afghanistan ally themselves when it comes to women and human rights the way Taliban do.
Yes.
And NRF is one of them. They don't ally with Taliban. Nobody in the world believe in the way Taliban do and suppress women especially. So they do support women's rights. They do promote girls' education. They have their own family members. They have recently established a women council within that. However, unfortunately, when it comes to giving space for alternative, the world still has not come to the point to give that space for alternative, for political or any other opposition to Taliban.
Thank you for that.
Are you presently working closely with them or in communication with them?
With
the National Resistance Front.
So we are representative of the women's resistance. I believe there is two kinds of resistance. One is the civic resistance and then the military resistance. I think Taliban have difficulty handling the civic resistance because they're a group of fighters. The more you resist them in a civic way, the more they cannot handle it. And that's why you see even a small group of women protesters, 50 women protesters on the streets, they don't know how to handle them. They keep shooting at the women protesters directly because they don't know, and they're so much afraid. Like this morning, they went to my house. As I said, I came from Berlin, and there was a big conference where I spoke about all of this. And usually when I speak about this, the media picks it up, and the social media as well. They're so scared of the Twitter. So this morning they went to my house, which my cousin and my sister live there. And they have asked my sister and my cousin to leave the house in a week time. This is my own property. And obviously I built it with love and affection. Anybody would love their house. I miss the particulars of my bedroom. I miss the particulars of the flowers in the garden. Everything I did it for myself. So they went today this morning, and there is a letter actually. Do you have the letter? They gave a letter to my cousin saying that can you leave the house in a week time because we are and they refer to my Twitter. They said she is always against us. She is talking against us. Look at her Twitter. Look at her speeches. Look at her statement. I'm sure there are many. They are killing a lot of former security forces. But the level of intolerance that they have towards the civic resistance is enormous. They don't tolerate civic resistance. They keep arresting women. So with NRF we partner because obviously we don't disown them because all other forces should come together to form an opposition which is alternative. Taliban would not be able to. We cannot dismantle them only by civic movement.
Yeah.
All forces should put their hands together, and with them, like last month there was early May actually, there was a conference in Vienna where the leader of NRF participated, and some of us also participated on behalf of the women movement. So we are trying to empower the women movement, because Taliban don't know how to handle these women. When they see them, they're like, I don't know what to do. So they sometimes shoot to them, they arrest them, they imprison them, and these women are extremely brave. They face, if you have seen these photos, they face Taliban, and it's not easy. It's not easy to face Taliban in that circumstances.
So your advocacy is mainly based on advocacy in the West. But do you ever worry that, you know, being seen as Western or being capable of communicating or engaging with the US, with, you know, Western partners, Europe, NATO, relevant parties, do you think that's ever a double-edged sword? Because, you know, on one hand, obviously engaging with the West, you give advocates for, you know, more democracy or justice in Afghanistan just a greater visibility on the international stage, international community. And then on the other hand, this is a current within the Muslim world, the Islam world, that a lot of people are anti-Western. And they will say, Western intervention has made our lives even worse. So, you know, some people would say that being close to the West or advocating in the West is a disconnect from their concerns or their priorities. So how do you reconcile those two?
It's a very, very important question, and thank you for bringing this issue up. One of the things Taliban did in the last years before they entered Kabul was their serious engagement with the region. They seriously engaged with the regional countries, including with Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, with China. They traveled several times to China, and we know that they were the protocol they were given was like a protocol of a high-level president or somebody with red carpet. They engaged with Turkey. They had office in Qatar, which is a Sunni Muslim country. So yes, they have engaged with the region, and I think one of the shortcomings of the Afghan foreign policy then was engaging with the region. Our foreign policy is on the basis of neutrality. We're a buffer state. However, in the last 20 years, any government could hardly keep that neutrality. So we try to engage with the West, with our strategic partners, the so-called strategic partners. I'm being asked this question a lot by a lot of Western people that, you know, the West betrayed you. They left without even, you know, putting you as a priority. Why do you engage with them? Personally, I'm not only engaging with the Western world, I'm also engaging with the Muslim community as well.
Yeah.
I am talking with the Gulf states, with Qatar, with UAE, because UAE is now in the UN. UAE is the pen holder for Afghanistan. And UAE is also the focal point for women, peace and security. And early this month, UAE, before the Doha, there was a special envoys meeting convened by the UN on the 3rd of May in Doha, if you recall. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres participated in that, and actually he chaired it. Just before going to there, based on the proposal from UAE, the UN Security Council approved a resolution in support of women and girls in Afghanistan. I was in Indonesia in December, in Bali, where I met Indonesian foreign minister who is a woman and a Muslim. Obviously, Indonesia is the Muslim majority country. We are trying to engage with them, but this is a shortcoming. Now, I can see that there is a shift of politics among the Muslim countries when it comes to their policy and approach towards Taliban. For instance, when the ban on, when the 21st of December ban on girls' university happened, I reached out to some of my friends with the OIC member states. You know what OIC is, right? Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Some of the friends in the OIC, which are mainly, or all of them are Muslim and Arab, some of them, countries, I reached out to them and I said, can you react? Because this is going to, come to your own countries if you do not react today and if you do not stop it. The next day, I saw there was a lot of reactions from Qatar, from UAE, from Saudi Arabia, which is now opening up, from Indonesia, obviously. But statements are not enough. You're right, we need to engage with the Muslim countries, but that interconnectivity of politics, because even these Muslim world, they're so interconnected in their foreign policy with what the West wants. You know, so it's not only European countries that needs to have more independent foreign policy as opposed to US, but it's also some of these Muslim countries, I guess, that are so interdependent to what the US says. Obviously now I can see there is a shift because you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran relationship after China mediation is improving. For the first time they had a diplomatic exchange. You have followed that probably. For the first time a contract with Russia Russia and China has been signed based on yen currency, not dollar. I think there is going to be more, so that kind of Eastern Bloc is shaping or reshaping itself. I don't know if we're expecting a second Cold War or not, but the Eastern Bloc is reshaping its politics, but I think there is a lot of interconnectivity. So we believe that even for us to engage with the Muslim world, with OIC member states, I'm not talking about the public, but the government level relationship, those countries are so hugely influenced by the Western politics.
I think that's really interesting. I'm just going to unpack that really quickly. So my first question here is, just going off the idea of, you know, focusing on the West. We'll get to the Eastern Bloc later, but focusing on the West. So, an engagement with the West. So you'll be arguing on the side of John Bolton later at the Oxford Union, right? And in the debate about the role of the West in upholding democracy around the world, whatever that is defined. How can you convince yourself to be on the side of a person who some people have deemed to be Islamophobic, racist, imperialist, neoconservative, whose statements have often kind of depicted the Middle East as almost like a playground for America? So how do you live with that?
Well, I believe the world has become a little bit extreme in their perception towards each other. For instance, you know, and I think in many occasions the war is a war of perception. In a traditional way, if you are a Muslim and Arab, which I'm not Arab, I'm a Muslim but I'm not Arab. If you are a Muslim and Arab, the perspective towards Western world, especially Western women, is that Western women are too liberal, they're too progressive, they don't stick to their values, you know, and then the opposite side, the Western people probably perspective and view towards Eastern world is that they are too regressive, that they are very conservative, that they are not pro-education, that they are not pro-work, that Islam is not about, what's it, not majority, but that is the perception. That Islam is not, you know, whatever the practice of these traditional figures is, they link it to Islam without understanding what true Islam is. Because obviously, why would a non-Muslim know the actual Islam? But the practice of these governments, scholars, etc., indicate that Islam sometimes, especially Taliban, for instance, in the case of, it creates a lot of Islamophobia. So I see that there is a growth. I feel, personally, I think none of it is correct. We need to create a middle ground, a third room, so to say. You know, creating a third room and a middle ground is not easy, because if you go in reality, you see none of these perspectives are correct. So how can we really correct that? By creating a middle ground. And middle ground would only be created if we have much more exchange. But the more Eastern Bloc has become conservative, and you know, governments like Taliban, they are not government for us, they are de facto. But any power like those or any other dictators, powers on the basis of ideology, create a phobia that in the Western world also the same reaction. The conservative parties get to power in reaction. Look at Italy, for instance. Look at you know, Sweden. I don't know who is going to be the next president of United States, but there is a reaction. You know, there is a reaction. There has been less efforts to put you know, a politics of common understanding. And most of the time, the politicians, including in myself or others, we don't understand or we underestimate the power of our words. We don't know if we make a statement on media, how much it actually impacts the public's perspective all the way to the villages, which it does. It does impact. If it is if it's a word or statement about inclusion, about coexistence, it will impact the people. But if it's about exclusion, if it's about distance, it's about saying no to diversity, it will also have the impact. So I think the more politicians talk about phobia of any kind and politics of self-centric, the more reaction will be more Islamic groups, extremist Islamic groups, or the other way. Western extreme groups who would be disrespectful to the beliefs and values. We have seen many cases in Europe of disrespecting the Quran, disrespecting our Prophet, peace be upon him. So I think we need to really create that third room. And that third room, how can we create that? It's not easy, because after the fall of Taliban, I have tried to distance myself a little bit from this politics of ethnic. And the reason is because I think all ethnic groups in Afghanistan should unite against Taliban. We should marginalize Taliban in a way that they do not represent any ethnic group.
Yeah.
I have been finding it very difficult for myself, because all those people who have seen me for years speaking what they want me to speak as their representative, now me telling them not to lay down in the line of ethnics, I find it very uncomfortable for myself. So moving from your traditional comfort zone, which is either conservative in religion or ethnic, to an untraditional zone is not an easy move. You have to create new constituents for yourself. And that's what we should do.
So, are you saying that John Bolton's statements are you saying that John Bolton's statements are not Islamophobic? Are you saying that, like, even if it's Islamophobic, it's not his fault? It's this kind of mischaracterization of him that's the fault? I
think, why should somebody unnecessarily say something that would create reaction? There's a better way. I mean, freedom is not unlimited, right? Freedom of speech also means that you should not hurt somebody else. There is a limit to everything. If people try to hurt others under claim that there is a freedom of speech that they do, or freedom of action or belief or opinion, I don't support that. I think we have to have freedom until the extent that it doesn't hurt anybody else. So I think there is a lot of moves in the Western world that in reaction create more violence in our parts of the world. And as you say, create more opposition, and those people challenge our stance, saying that why do you work with these world? In fact, a lot of people in Afghanistan tell me, why do you work with the Western world while they left Afghanistan, betrayed us? Why do you work with them? Don't even talk to them. Because they go to that level, there is a huge distrust. And so I believe that why should unnecessarily we create statements? If we do create mixed statements or action, the reaction is the same. If it is from a Muslim community or any other community.
Moving on to the second part of the question that I mentioned, which is about Eastern Bloc. You said, well, China has the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, okay. Just two more questions. There's China's Belt and Road Initiative, and then there's Russia's renewed interest in the Middle East and Central Asia, as you mentioned. Do you see Afghanistan under Taliban becoming a close ally of this so-called Eastern Bloc moving forward, and Afghanistan receiving some form of international recognition from some countries of the world, maybe not democratic, but Eastern Bloc?
So Afghanistan foreign policy under Taliban is not absolutely clear at this stage. However, there is a tendency towards the Eastern Bloc. There is an enormous exchange between China and Afghanistan. Yeah. In December, the Chinese signed 2 contracts with Taliban about excavation of the gas and oil from Afghanistan. The Russians accepted the credentials of a Taliban diplomat. Iran gave our embassy to the Taliban. Pakistan the same. China the same. Kazakhstan the same. I think for China, what they want is just to get rid of any US footprint in their neighborhood. That's what they want. Although Chinese business people were attacked, you know, in the hotel in Kabul, but I think that's not what priority for China is. China wants to have Afghanistan, if not under direct influence, but at least like under the influence in a way to get a distance from the US. Meanwhile, I think the US also want, like, Taliban are in a good position for now in terms of their foreign policy, I would say, because they're a fighter, right? So each side want to have Taliban in their support. In case they want to create trouble for the other side, they can use Taliban. So Taliban are in that position because they're troublemakers. For now, the tendency is working with the Eastern Bloc. And that's why you see China, for instance, in Security Council, always talking about humanitarian issue, not human rights issue, obviously. Russia, the same. Countries who support them, the same. And then you see Europe and US talking about human rights, but not doing anything, only talking about it. So I think over time, we have to wait and watch the situation, especially what will happen in Ukraine will shape the future of the second Cold War. But at this stage, I think Taliban feel more comfortable working with the region, which is something we didn't do in the last years of the previous government. We should do that actually, as women group as well. Women groups, they're working with the region. They're working with and they get a lot of contracts. They get a lot of financial support, and that's why they don't care about humanitarian aid. Recently, they banned the UN female staff working, local national staff working with the UN, and as a consequence, probably the UN would decide not to work in Afghanistan, but they will not be affected because they have signed many contracts with China and other, and even Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other countries.
So I'm just aware of the time here, but I want to ask a very quick yes or no question, which is,
okay.
Are you fine with Afghanistan becoming an ally or even a vassal state of China if China is able to promise infrastructure and economic investment?
Under Taliban?
Yes.
No, I'm not. Under Taliban, any government try to support, I'm not okay with it. With China, we share border. In fact, I come from a province where we share border with China. My province share direct border. So we do want to keep a good relationship with China. We do want to have we also have historic relationship, Belt and Road, the Abrishon, the Silk Road, the former Silk Road. We do want to keep relationship. But if they try to work with Taliban just to keep their own borders safe and keep US out of Afghanistan, no.
Koofi, thank you. So just one last closing question, if you can keep it shorter, so we can open up the room for a group discussion. You have survived assassination attempts, scathing criticisms from allies, and political upheaval in a country you have so dearly loved for so many years. What is one lesson you would like to impart to us as Oxford students who would like to make a change in the world around us?
Well, as I said, Farishta John, most of the things that I wanted to follow as my passion, and I do want to follow as my political belief and passion, is not something that I do it as a political theory. I do it as a passion, I do it as something that I believe. So if politics is not mixed with passion, with not belief, anything, if you don't put your passion, your love, your affection, you're not going to make an impact. So you need to love what you do first yourself, and then people will start believing in it. What I would like to leave here is that freedom, liberty, we all come from parts of the world where there is imbalance. There is the world is very unjust when it comes, especially to gender, to religion. It's very unjust place. To make it a just place comes with a cost, and that cost is not easy. I wish I was in Afghanistan. Even that means I was in prison. I prefer that. Many occasions I regret for leaving Afghanistan. Being imprisoned in Afghanistan would have been much better because there was a cause. I try to keep myself engaged, and a lot of people tell me that what I do now in terms of my advocacy, engaging the international community, creating women movement outside Afghanistan, they tell me that it's much more impactful. But I feel that I wanted to be part with people, as they say, parts of their ups and downs of the life. So believe in what you do first, you will make others believe in your cause. If you don't believe it, don't do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.